Tara, I am very, very excited to welcome you to the Better podcast. I have been following your work for some time, and I was thrilled when you and your team reached out to be on. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I know you are a master certified coach. You are really big on retraining your brain and becoming aware of your thoughts and your feelings. And one of the things I've come to realize, and we've had a lot of guests on the show that are very similar, as I just said to you in the pre-chat, in terms of philosophical underpinnings, is that your brain can be an unfair advantage if you know how to use it. And I think most of us are not aware that our thoughts are not who we are, that our thoughts and our feelings are just that. They are thoughts and feelings that the brain will randomly generate all day long, every day. And I wanted to maybe start off our conversation today by talking about where our beliefs come from and how do we begin to become awake to or aware of the idea of retraining our brain to be that unfair advantage that I mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you know how to manage your mind, you've got that unfair advantage. When you don't know how, it's more like an unfair disadvantage, right? Like
Yes.
it's like if you think about like the first person to, I don't know, domesticate a wild horse or something, it's like once you can ride the horse, you have an unfair advantage. The part where you don't know how to ride the horse, it might run you over or like run in the wrong direction, right? It's not even just like neutral playing field, you get an advantage. If you don't know how to manage your mind, I think you're operating at a disadvantage because you have no control over what's going on in your head. In terms of where our thoughts come from, I think there's like a real mix, right? So there's certain, I think of it as almost like, I always forget the word. I think it's strata. But if you think about like geologists look at levels of rock and sediment, right?
Yeah.
That like show how things have evolved over time. And I think our brains are a little bit like that, right? We have the most primitive part of our brains that we share with like lizards and, you know, the most primitive basic creatures. And that part of your brain is just very focused on like any threat, anything it sees as a threat and keeping you alive, right? And it's like completely unsuited for the modern world, basically, where almost none of our threats look like it's almost never something that literally wants to eat you, which is what that part of your brain evolved to deal with, right?
Right.
So it's like some of our thoughts, I think, especially the ones that we all tend to have in common or very similar to each other, come from that like evolutionary biology place. And then of course in modern society, there's so many other levels on top of that. There's like your family, how your family teaches you to think about things, you know, maybe 1% of which is explicit and like 99% of which is implicit, just watching how, you know, whatever gets passed down to you about how to be a person or, you know, what's important in life or how you should act or how you should behave, like all of that socialization that you get at home. And then as you get older and you start interacting with the outside world more, there's like all of the messages the media gives you and everything you learn at school. And so you have these like layers and layers and layers of what you've been taught to think. So if you think about, if we're using like a very modern technology analogy, think about your brain as like an open source code, right? Where anybody can go in there and edit the code and write lines of code and we're not even aware of it. And so then all of a sudden you're an adult and you have these thousands and thousands of thoughts. You didn't pick them out. You didn't curate a nice little closet for yourself. It's just like whatever junk people have been throwing in there for 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
Right. It's like going to the scrapyard. It's just like it's just everybody in the world has been like, here's some stuff for your closet and you don't even know what's happening. You go, and then when you start to do whatever, meditation, therapy, thought work, there are a lot of different ways of accessing your unconscious mind, right? Or just bring your awareness to it. It's like you open the door and you're like, oh my God, what is in here? Right? Like I didn't pick any of this. So I think you have to, the very first step is just any practice. I mean, I'm personally a fan of the kind of thought work that I do, of course, but there's a lot of ways that humans try to do this, but just starting to bring your awareness to what's going on. The thoughts you're conscious of are just like the little bit spilling out of the closet door and you don't even see like what all is behind there.
Right.
So you had the first step is always awareness, like learning what you're actually thinking, which most of us have no idea.
It's funny. I call them the Fab Four. I always say, you know, it's the mothers, fathers, teachers, and preachers, right? These are the people that, we needed love from them in order to survive. So we will adopt whatever they tell us about our worth, about our
Mhm.
environment, about our role, whatever it is, be it positive or negative, right?
Totally.
And we will seek to reinforce those beliefs over time because of our hardwiring, our neurological hardwiring in order to receive love, in order to feel connected, to feel like you belong somewhere. So I love what you're saying in terms of becoming aware, because I've heard, a lot of your work on your podcast. I was listening to one of your podcasts. I forget which episode. It was one of the more recent ones in preparation for our conversation today. And you said, the brain likes to be right. So your
Mhm.
brain will seek out evidence that it already believes, whether it's positive or negative. So you could have a desire to, I don't know, uh, become a doctor, or I'm just like pulling whatever, whatever comes to my mind. Like you could have this desire to become a doctor, but if you've been told, well, you're not really smart, well, no one in your family's ever done this before, like how are you going to afford it? There's all these different things. Like your brain will seek to find those things and reinforce them through cognitive um, biases, right? I had Jennifer Kolari, who's she's a social worker, like she's a child expert, a parenting expert, and I was lamenting to her about my young son, and he had come to me. And of course, this is, for any parent that's listening, this is just the worst thing that your child could ever tell you. My young son was like, you know what, mommy, like I've seen you love my older brother more than you love me, and it's because of X and Y and Z. So of course I'm like I'm on a puddle of tears off in the corner, like rocking myself to sleep. But I was telling her this, and she's like, okay, so what you have to do is you have to make him feel seen and heard, right? Make him feel like his feelings are understood, but then switch it where you say, okay, so I totally understand why you feel like this. This must be like devastating for you to feel like mommy doesn't love you as much as, as much as as much as mommy loves, your older brother. But tomorrow, why don't you look for the opposite? Why don't you look for all the reasons why and how mommy shows you love? So this was done in a parenting context because I was like crying, I was like, I was in the fetal position, like, what have I done? I'm the worst mother. But is this a technique or a tool that we can use on ourselves as well, where we can say, okay, so what's the evidence? First, acknowledging our feelings, right? Because
Mhm.
we all have to learn how to feel our feelings. But can we have a similar conversation with ourselves in order to overcome our own cognitive biases or inherited beliefs, inherited, hand-me-down clothes, as you were saying in the closet?
Yeah, totally. It's one of my favorite exercises because I think of like it's like cognitive bias is this really it's like having a very powerful car. Like it's going to go in whichever direction you aim it, consciously or
Mhm.
unconsciously. And so if you don't turn the steering wheel, it's just going to keep driving the way it's been driving. It's just, and like your son is such a great example. It's like, who knows where that thought first came into his little head, right? But then once it was in there, his brain was like, okay, I got my assignment. I'm supposed to look for evidence that this is true. And then it just kept going. And of course, such a gift he even said that to you and that you were able to respond, right? Because some people instead just think that thought for 20 years, accumulating
Right,
evidence, right? And then it's
right.
like gets stronger and stronger and stronger. So I'm constantly giving my clients the assignment of like, I'll coach them on something like, let's say it's, my partner doesn't, value me, or my partner doesn't love me because and here's all my laundry list of evidence that I've accumulated for why. And I'm always giving them that assignment of like, okay, yes, right. We have to always feel that feeling we have, but what if tomorrow you went and looked for evidence that they do love you? And I think especially when we're talking about interpersonal relationships, we're always looking for people to express love the way we would express it, like
Right.
whatever our thing would be. And unfortunately, we're often partnered with people or we're related to people who have a different way of doing it. So I think that exercise, it can work for anything. I do it for work too. Like go find evidence that your colleagues do respect you. Go find evidence that you can do your job. But I think it's so powerful, especially in intimate relationships of any kind, because when you open your mind up enough to look for the ways that people might be expressing their care or support or respect for you that just aren't the same way you would do it, you
Mhm.
can see so much more, right? It'll be like somebody who's like, well, my partner doesn't love me because they don't plan romantic dates and write me poems, right? But then when they go look, it's like, oh, but you know what? They like always make my favorite breakfast and they always
Right.
take out the trash because they know I don't like to do that, right? It's just like a totally different love language, quote unquote. It doesn't have to fit into one of those 5 things, but
Right, but that's what it reminds me of. It reminds me of the
yeah.
5 love languages, and so my son, I think his love language is physical touch, and,
Mhm.
to use those 5
Yeah.
categories, it's like physical touch, and the other one would be, quality time, or it sounds
Mhm.
something like that. And I am both of those things. I'm very physically affectionate, and I definitely spend a lot of time, but there's, for whatever reason, there's a mismatch there. So I love
Mhm.
in interpersonal relationships with, whether it's a partner, those acts of service. Like, I love it when I come downstairs and my water is prepared for me exactly the way I like it,
Mhm.
and I have my coffee. Like that for me, I'm like, he really was like, my partner just loves me because he was just thinking about me that way. But I like to show love by like touch and massage, and
Mhm.
that's how I show love. So that was a really um uh it was a way for us to sort of understand each other. He likes to do things for me, and I like to
Mhm.
touch. Like, I like physical touch. So I love
Yeah, and I
working on
think
that.
people misuse that. Like, I mean, those 5 categories are fine. I think there's probably a million categories, right? It's
Yeah.
just looking for how your partner does it. But
Yeah.
I think people often misuse them in the sense that they're like, oh, okay, I know my love language. So now I can instruct my partner on how to deliver my love language the way I want it, which for
Mhm.
me is not what's useful about it. Trying to,
Mhm.
sure, share it if you want, but like getting into a power struggle over trying to make someone express their love the way they don't naturally do
Gifts.
it
I
does
need
not,
gifts.
yeah, that does not feel loving as it turns out, right? To me, that's more like, it's like the Rosetta Stone, right? It's like a translation tool so that you can go
Right.
and look for, like, I'm extremely verbal. My partner is not at all, but he will totally like make the water the way he thinks I like it, which like
Mhm.
I had to go consciously notice because I'm not someone who that would be one of my love language. Like, it wouldn't even occur to me. I'd
Right.
just be like, oh, water, thanks. But now
Mhm.
that I've watched that and I've done that on purpose, I'm like, oh, that's, he does the water because he thinks that's what, that's
Right.
what would help. So yeah, but I mean, to go back to your original question, yes, I think that exercise is powerful for anything, right? People like, of course, I have so many accomplished clients who are like, who have imposter syndrome. It's like, I'm a fraud, I don't know how to do my job. Meanwhile, you're doing your job. You've been doing your job
Mhm.
for 20 years. You've gotten promoted. Clearly, you know how
Mhm.
to do your job, right?
Mhm.
But your
Mhm.
brain is just always looking for, like, it's like their brains are always looking for all the time. They don't notice any of the times that they know what to do, can handle a situation, know how to solve a problem, get something done, right? That all gets swept under the rug. They don't even notice that stuff. And they just are only noticing the times that they aren't sure what to do, or like do feel anxious, or do feel out
Mhm.
of their depth, or someone does disagree, or whatever else. So going through that exercise, any belief you have, if you can tell your brain to look for evidence the contrary, you will find it. Your brain just needs training. It's like a puppy, right? Like, needs to be told what to do. Otherwise,
Yeah.
it's going to bring you, like dead birds that you don't want. You
All
need
the dead
to
carcasses in
like,
the yeah.
yeah, exactly. Or it's going to like rip up the house, right? It's like
Right.
a puppy that has too much energy. It's going to eat the drapes. Like, you have to tell it what you want it to do.
You mentioned imposter syndrome, and I definitely want to double click on that because I don't know about you, and I would love to know what your thoughts are based on your clinical experience working with women. But I have found that this is, and I'm not saying that it does not exist in men, but it exists at a rate of 100% in the women that I have worked with.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, like high functioning executives, people that are running 8-figure businesses, and they think that they are the work, they have this debilitating imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
So do you think there's a gender difference and maybe it's socialization, maybe it's, have you noticed that there is the frequency with which imposter syndrome is baked into the female DNA? Is there something, I mean, this is just my clinical observance. It could just be an N of one for me, but
No,
is that,
no, no. I 100% I think it's socialization. Like, I don't think, I don't think it's genetic. But yeah, I mean, I think we are raised in a society that even now, of course, I think we've made progress socially. We have more examples of women in leadership, but we are
Mhm.
still, when you think about it, it's like the feminist movement, the second wave feminist movement was 40, 50 years ago, right? It was like,
Right.
my mother was alive when women in some states couldn't have their own credit cards, and she's not that old. Like, it's
Mhm.
not that
Yeah.
long in social change time.
Mhm.
And so, yes, things are improving, but we are still getting all of those messages of like, men are just kind of generically assumed to be competent, to know what they're talking about, to be smart, to be authoritative, right? And women are assumed to not know as much, to not be as authoritative, to there's a lot more of the like, I mean, you never hear about a man like, well, he probably got ahead because he was so good looking and slept with the boss. You know, it's like, that's
Never.
not ever something you hear,
Yeah.
but you hear that about women. Yes, less so, but I still think that kind of talk goes on. It's just a little less socially acceptable. So I see this in all my women clients. And I think the other problem is that women are, they're socialized. My headphones just died, so I'll just take them out and hope
That's
for the
okay.
best.
No worries.
Hold on a second. Sorry, let me switch this to just the speaker. Sorry about that. Can you say something?
Hi, test, 1, 2. Testing, testing.
So weird. I'm sorry. 1 second.
No problem.
They died and now I can't hear anything, but I think I just have to, let me just turn them off. And then
I can hear you now.
now we should be good. All right.
Okay.
To reselect everything. Okay. So I think the other element that goes with imposter syndrome is there's the like authoritativeness, respectability, smartness piece, like we're socialized, and then I think that there's the people pleasing gets mixed up in it. Like women are socialized to be mostly concerned that everybody likes them and approves of them. And so that really gets in the way too. It's like you can't really be strong in your authority about something when you're also thinking, like, is everybody going to like me? What are they thinking about me? Right? There's this other facing part that women are socialized to have. So, I mean, I wouldn't say no men have imposter syndrome, but I for sure think it's more like women, or, I think, and men probably more likely if they are marginalized in some other way, like men who are LGBTQ or men who are men of color or whatever else. Like, I think any group that's not straight white men gets that messaging.
And they have, men have their own set of issues, right? Like they're socialized not to show ever any emotion. It's a sign of weakness, all those things. So I'm not suggesting that men don't have, and that they don't even experience imposter syndrome. I think that of course they do, but I just have found it, to your point, like every single woman, and she could be insanely successful.
Yeah. It has
And
nothing to do with it.
it doesn't matter, right? So sometimes and I've had private conversations with women and that are, like I said, 8-figure, running these huge businesses. And they'll say, I think maybe I feel like I'm running on empty. I feel like I'm at the top of the ladder, but it's the wrong wall. Like I get all of these sort of self doubt. Did I make the right choice? And I've done those things myself. Sometimes I'm like, God, did I choose the right career? Did I, like, why am I not this? Why am I not that? And, I guess the where I'm trying to lead this is for the woman who doesn't necessarily feel empowered, or maybe she believes in female empowerment. Maybe she is a feminist, as I am. I am a feminist. I do believe that we are separate and distinct from men in physiological ways, which I've written about and talked about quite a bit. And also, I think our contribution and the way that we contribute is also distinct, but it should not be discounted. So if someone is a feminist and wants to feel empowered, but she doesn't necessarily feel empowered, what are some of the ways that she can move towards that and start to negate some of the imposter syndrome that often, like I said, is baked into our DNA, and it's almost sort of par for the course in terms of being a woman.
Yeah. So many good things to respond to there. I guess the two like preliminary things I want to say is I totally agree about men are socialized in ways that are screwed up for them, right? Like patriarchy is bad for everyone. It's just different patterns, I think.
Yeah.
And in terms of, in terms of the socialization, I think, I actually think it's helpful to think of it less as something baked into our DNA and more as the product of a thought pattern that we're not aware of, because that's where, like, we can't splice, or unless you want to think of it as like, and I'm a geneticist, so I can splice my own DNA, right? Like however you want to take the metaphor. Yes. But I think, with imposter syndrome, I like to really, a lot of my work, I think because I was a lawyer before I was a life coach. I'm just very like logical and analytical. A lot of the work I do has to do with like really breaking down the absurdities of our thought patterns, because once you start to see the internal contradictions, it just becomes harder to take it seriously. To me, it's like in The Wizard of Oz where they pull back the curtain. It's like once you take the mask off, it's just, you can't take it quite as seriously. So
Like the Matrix, like once you
yeah, it's like once you
yeah.
go through and see
Yeah.
it, yeah. So, or like when you're a kid and you learn, yeah, like, oh, it's actually just a puppet. Like you can't be as scared now, it's a puppet. And so I
Right.
think with imposter syndrome is particularly fascinating because so many women have this thought of like, well, I'm a fraud, right?
Mm.
And when you really break it down, it's like, did you lie on your resume? Did they not, right? Are you not a lawyer or not a doctor? Like, do you not have an MBA? Like, did you not go to the school that you said you went to? Right? What does that even mean? And particularly like, are you being yourself? There's no such, if you're being yourself, you can't be a fraud. What would that mean? Right? You're not pretending to be anything you aren't.
Mhm.
So there's all of the confidence building thought work that you can do and using cognitive bias to your advantage. And I do a lot of work on, and we can talk more about like how to shift thoughts incrementally using neutral thoughts. But
Yeah.
I think with imposter syndrome in particular, it's like any thought pattern, the more dramatic your brain is being in a thought pattern, the more I find like a little bit of humor and absurdity helps. Like imposter syndrome is such a dramatic thought pattern. Your brain's literally like, you're a fraud. They're going to figure you out. And it's like, but are you pulling a long con, right? Like, is your name not Deborah? Like what is it people are going to figure out, right? Like, what is the fraud that you didn't bilk the federal government for $50 million. This isn't a fraud. Like fraud is a legal term. It's not a thing you can be. So starting to like, I think part of what happens with our thoughts is we're so afraid of our negative thoughts, right? That we like don't want to encounter them or spend any time with them. And so our brain gets away with just saying ludicrous things to us all the time because we don't want to look straight at it. We just try to run away. And so a lot of this work for me, I think, is being like, okay, no, we're going to sit down and look at everything in there. Like, I know it's a little scary. We're going to work on having our feelings, but we're also just going to start to look at this and be like, does that thought even make sense? Like what am I saying, right? How am I like, I've led this business from 7 to 8 figures and we've done these things. Like, in what way is this a fraud? Or in what way is this like, how am I possibly an imposter? Like starting to engage logically with your own brain. Most of us don't do that because when we try to argue with our brains, we like take our premise. We're sort of like, well, I am bad at my job, but let me see if I can try to like find a slightly better way to think about that. So this is a long-winded answer, but I think starting to both work on more positive neutral thoughts, which we can talk more about, and challenging the thoughts you have and getting to know them, right? This is what we talked about in the beginning. You have to get to know what's really in there, not just I think so many women feel burnt out because they've been trying to hustle their way. They're like, if I can achieve enough, I'll stop feeling this way.
Right.
Right. And then they get to the top of the ladder and they're like, wait, what? I still feel this way. I thought I was going to hustle my way out of this.
I remember hearing a quote, something like, imposters don't feel, if you are truly an imposter, you would never know what imposter syndrome is.
Right. And you wouldn't be confused. You'd be like, I'm perpetrating a fraud. My name is not Deborah. I don't have an MBA. I lied about all of this. Like, it would be a totally different experience. You wouldn't be like, am I a fraud or not? I might be.
Right. Yeah. So let's actually go into the neutralizing thinking, because I like this framework, because I know that, as you were saying, we can be total drama queens. We can totally be saying, I'm the worst. As soon as they find out that I'm actually unqualified, they're going to fire me and I'm going to be blacklisted, or, whatever the thinking is.
Right.
So walk me through what neutral thoughts are, how we can begin to use that. And just, this is really tying in what we've been talking about moving away from the schematic representation that we have, these cognitive biases that we have, into something that is much more healthy and representative of reality.
Yeah. Or even positively delusional. I mean, I think we might as well go all the way, right? We don't even know what reality is most of the time. So we might as well think it's positive. Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the reasons that like life coaching sometimes, or certainly positive thinking, gets a bad rap is that it is it's like, can be too Pollyanna-ish in some ways, and it doesn't resonate for a lot of people, because if you think about negative thought patterns as a habit, let's say it's like being you're right-handed, you're used to writing with your right hand all the time. It's like somebody just saying to you, just believe you can write with your left hand and then it'll work perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that's not how it works, right? If you've been practicing thinking that you're unqualified, people are going to find out, you're not doing a good job, everybody hates you, whatever you've been practicing thinking for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, most of us cannot just wake up one morning, practice one affirmation and say, I'm amazing at my job and the best person to do it. Believe it right away, and that solves our problem. Like if that were the case, we wouldn't have a multi-billion-dollar self-help industry and therapy and coaching and everything else, right? So I work a lot on the idea of, I switch back and forth. I call them either neutral thoughts, or sometimes I call them ladder thoughts. You're like laddering your way
Mhm.
up. But
Mhm.
it's basically a technique of learning how to, number one, still you have to become aware of what those thoughts are, literally, that you're having. But then rather than just try to go to the opposite, coming up with a small, believable, often pretty logical thought that you can think. So for instance, in the body image context, if you have a body part that you have a lot of negative thinking about, like if your thought is like, my cellulite is disgusting and it shouldn't be there, and if it weren't there, I would feel better about myself, and my partner thinks it's gross, whatever, all of your negative thoughts about your cellulite. A neutral thought would be something like, many humans have thighs that look like this, or most women have some cellulite on their bodies. We're not going straight to like, I'm an amazing goddess, right? And like, I'm the sexiest thing that ever lived, because you don't believe that. And you're not going to get any emotional payoff from practicing a thought you don't believe. But you will get a little bit of emotional payoff from practicing a thought you can believe that's just a little bit less negative than your current thought. And so let's say you're dealing with imposter syndrome and your thought is, they're going to find out that I'm a fraud, right? The positive thought you can't believe might be like, I'm the best person in the world for this job and I'm amazing at it. Like maybe we want to get there, but we're not going to get there in one jump.
Mhm.
But a neutral thought might be something like, I've worked in this industry for 15 years, so I do have some experience at it, right? Or like, I've been doing this job for 5 years and I've helped the company increase whatever, its revenue, its success, like looking for practical, true, concrete statements that you can practice thinking. They will not feel amazing, but they will feel a little bit better. And when you get that little bit of relief, you're teaching your brain that this activity is useful. You got like a little bit of either dopamine or just a little less suffering. And
Mhm.
so then you get more buy-in from your brain. You create like a virtuous cycle. I don't really like the word virtuous, but like a positive cycle where your brain sees like, oh, it's worth doing this. It feels a little better. Let me keep practicing.
Right.
And then you can keep going.
Is there any benefit so the example I gave you before with my son was acknowledging those feelings, like, I totally hear and see and understand why you feel like this. So with my son, it was because he thinks that I love my older son more
Right.
than him. Is there any use or any usefulness in saying, okay, I understand why you might feel like an imposter syndrome because of this long laundry list that you've just presented me, all the things why you're a fraud or whatever. But here's a way for us to, you know, and I ask this because I have found this useful for me, because when I acknowledge my own feelings, there's almost less resistance when I can stack up the evidence that is opposing to it. So if I say, you know what, that's just crazy that you think that you're an imposter, or you think you're the worst mother ever, or whatever. But if I acknowledge the feeling that, yes, I understand why you feel like you're the worst mother ever, or the worst whatever ever,
Mm-hmm.
that you, in the same way that you might speak to a child and acknowledge a child's feelings, that you're almost talking to this like inner child that's like, and we've spoken to a lot of people where we've talked about this idea of reparenting and
Mm-hmm.
inner work and self-parenting and stuff. Do you think that there's value in that as well, like as the first domino, in acknowledging the feeling the feeling, and then doing some of this? What you're talking about is very CBT. It's very cognitive behavioral therapy. Like, here's the evidence for, here's the evidence against, and let's actually logically look at this and see which one makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yes, there's like, so a few things. I mean, number one, think we always have to be willing to have the feeling first. If you are, and when I talk about a feeling, what I really mean by that is like a physical sensation in your body. And when we are resisting our emotions, we can never change a thought. It doesn't work at all. So whenever I have a client who's like, well, I've been working on this for like 2 weeks, I've been doing the models that I teach, like I've been trying to change my thought and it's not working. I always know it's because they're not willing to have whatever feeling that original thought is creating for them. They're trying to push it away. And that just never works because you're just signaling to your brain that something dangerous is happening, that this feeling is dangerous, that we need to get away from it. And so that's that old therapy saying, like, what you resist persists. Like,
Mm.
so I definitely think you need to have, it's always process the emotion, be willing to have it, then you can work on the thoughts. In terms of like that kind of phrase of, I understand why you feel this way. Yeah. I mean, I think there's like a lot of nuances depending on how you do this work. For me, like 100%, it makes sense you feel that way because you're thinking these thoughts, right? Which is like a subtle but important difference. I would never say to a client, like, it totally makes sense you feel this way because of these true facts that you've identified, right? Which is totally not what you were saying to your son either, but just for the listeners. Like,
Yes.
because we have such cognitive bias, your people's brains can easily like miss that distinction, right? And then they're just reinforcing their negative thoughts. But yeah, I'm always like, of course you feel terrible. Your thought is, I'm a terrible mother. My mother loves my brother more than me. Like, anybody who thought that thought would feel this terrible emotion. It's totally normal and natural. It just doesn't mean it's true, right? Just because you have an emotion doesn't mean that something bad is actually happening. And in terms of, yeah, I mean, there are similarities to CBT, especially in the beginning stages, I think, where I always want people to be able to grow to is like, forget what's even true because we really don't know, right? If I'm just going to be, the neuroscience on us like hallucinating our own reality basically is fascinating, right? But if I'm basically just going to be hallucinating my own reality all the time, like, what's the most amazing hallucination I could have? Like, let me just go all the way. So, and that's the part where I think it starts to like, that's not so CBT-ish anymore. But I think especially in the beginning, yeah, and that's the sort of like thought, feeling, behavior cycle that a lot of the work is based on, that like flesh out in some different ways, is of course overlaps with that. And I think, I mean, to me, it's like people and cultures all over the world for thousands of years, right, have been teaching these same things. There's not really that many new ideas about how to be a human. We just are always, I think, teaching them in different ways, explaining them in different ways, trying to fit them to the current cultural context. Like, whatever metaphors Buddhist monks used 3,000 years ago, they weren't using metaphors like open source computer and
Right.
going to the town dump. And it's like, we're all just, I think all of us teachers, coaches, therapists, like anybody doing this work, we're using our own insight and our own experience of like a lot of longstanding human wisdom to try to help people cope better.
I love that. And I think for men and women especially, at least in terms of my observance, we hold on to those schemas. We hold on to those beliefs. So anything that challenges, because they used to serve us, right? Like they
Right.
served us at one point, whether it was to get out of a threatening situation, maltreatment as a child, any sort of trauma, emotional trauma, physical trauma, sexual, and any kind of trauma that you can imagine. These schemas, these ways of thinking were survival mechanisms. But at some point, I think we have to figure out how to, overlay the code, as you were saying, like we can, or amplify or step up on the ladder so that we can see the different stratifications in the soil. So this is like the foundational, this is kind of what got you out of 0 to 7. And now we can start to grow into the adult form that our bodies have grown into, but often our emotional and our mental states, we often stay as a little, scared, determined, stubborn 8-year-old, emotionally and mentally speaking.
And
And
some of them we just haven't questioned, I think. Like it's like when you think about all the cultural beliefs, like people used to believe the earth was flat. It
right.
wasn't necessarily a trauma response. It was just what everybody believed and had been told, right? And people were like willing to kill other people to defend that belief. But of course, it turned out now most of us don't believe that anymore. So I
Mhm.
think there's like all different kind of, and people I think are more, it's like, I think we can be very attached to thoughts for different reasons. Sometimes it is that like it was served you at one point, it was your survival mechanism, so of course your brain's really attached to it. Sometimes it's like it just seems so common sense to you because everyone believes it, which is
Mhm.
why it can be so fascinating to work with people from particularly like insular communities that have different beliefs than the rest of the general world does right now, right? Because you just see, like, depending on what you're taught as a child is the truth that everyone agrees on, right? It will shape your brain in so many different ways, and it'll play out, as you get older and your reasoning gets more complex and you're applying these subconscious thoughts to all different situations. You're just like adding another layer on the edifice and like strengthening and shoring up that this is how things are, that whole perspective. But that's why it's also so freeing when you finally get it's like you're hammering the little chinks in to let in a little light. And when you finally get to the point where that wall can collapse,
Mhm.
it's just so mind-blowing, right? To see that like the world may not be the way that you thought it was and that something different is possible. Like that's the, to me, this work is really about like, it's like emotional mental liberation work, right? Of like, how do we liberate ourselves?
Well, let's parse this with a conversation around desire and wanting.
Mm-hmm.
This is a perfect time to get us thinking about what it is that we want. And I had a coach once who was telling me, you need to create. So I've had many people over the years say, you know what you need to do? You need to make a joy list. You need to make a dreams
Mm.
list. You need to make a desires list.
It's always a list. We're very into list
The
life
very
coaches.
list, yeah. So we got to list all the thoughts, and then now we got to think about what it is that we actually want. And I think, even just the current situation where we're cocooning, everybody's at home. I think that this is a really good time for us to be thinking about, okay, what is it I actually want to do with my life, with my family, whatever vertical you've identified that's important to you. So I often talk about things like, your health and fitness, your creativity, your intellectual life, your career, your finances, your family, your social life, all of the whatever you've identified as important to you. How does a man or woman move towards identifying what it is that they want? And I want to just have a special cutout for women again, because I
Mm.
find that it is harder for us to actually connect to that. So I've talked about this in terms of getting into your hips and dancing and physical movement and
Mm-hmm.
kind of just moving so that you can start to create that sensory feedback
Mm-hmm.
and stimulating those creative juices. That I call it big ovary energy, like, your womb energy,
Mm-hmm.
which is the ultimate creation, right? So I want to sort of punt that question to you in
Yeah.
terms of,
So
yeah.
I think that especially with women, and I will say, like, I used to work with, I started out my career and I worked with men and women, and now I work with people who identify or are socialized as women. So I think I can speak more to that. But I think that with my experience is truthfully that it is not actually true that women don't know what they want. What is true is that they have layers of thoughts that are getting in the way.
Mhm.
And so I think that for me, the way that I think about it and teach it is usually that figuring out what you want, it's like figuring out, which is what people say all the time, like, I just can't even figure out what I want. It's like not the right term. What you are really doing is like excavating what you want or like uncovering what you want. Because every time I coach somebody about something like this, where they're like, I don't know what I want to do. It can be a 17-year-old saying, I don't know what I want to do for a career, or it can be like a 60-year-old saying, I don't know what I want to do after my divorce or whatever. Deep down, they do have an idea of what they want to do, but there is so many thoughts layered on top of like, what will other people think? And my parents would approve, or it's too hard, or I'm not good enough, or I can't be a success like that, or like, what about this thing? What about that thing? And so I think for me, it's more a process of like when people start with me and that's one of their questions, I'm usually like, don't worry about that for like 3 months. We need to like learn the tools and learn how to start to parse all of these thoughts you have. Because right now you're not like capable of discerning it. It's maybe discern is the right word. It's like discerning what you want or tuning into what you want. I think it exists down there. And honestly, I think sexual desire is the same, right? Like, however, we're talking about what you want, like for a lot of women, it's, of course, there are hormonal issues, whatever sometimes people have, but it's often not that there isn't any desire. It's that it's so muffled by all of the thoughts that are impacting what you think about your body, what you think about your sexuality, what your thoughts are about your partner and what they do around the house and there's like so many thoughts that are getting in the way. So I think it's like there's a lot of static on the radio, and what this work, the way that I approach it, is helping people, and totally like embodiment practices might be some of it. There's a lot of ways to get into that energy. But I think like some people are scared to even go there or can't even do that yet. And I think that a lot of it is like clearing up those thoughts. And the interesting thing I found is when I had a retreat where I did a burlesque dance class with my students. When we go to the embodiment, we still have to end up doing some of the coaching work, because what happens is people start to move and then all those thoughts come up, right? And then like all those emotions come up. So it's sort of like any road leads to Rome. Like we're going to get to that work that we need to do. But I think it's a process of like, of clearing out all that fuzz on the radio, which has to do with like what you think other people expect of you, what you think you're capable of, what seems reasonable, what you're good enough to do, all of that. It's rare, I think, like, but we're very committed to that story sometimes. I just coached somebody about this with relationships who was kept insisting she didn't know what she wanted from her relationship. And when I finally was like, okay, if he showed up on your door and he was like, hey, I'm all in, I want to get married, what would you say? And she immediately was like, yes, I want to do it. Right. I'm like, you do know what you want. You have a conflict, which is that he doesn't want that. And you haven't worked through all the thoughts you have about the relationship and you don't want to let it go. So you're telling yourself that you don't know what you want. You do know what you want. Right. And that same thing happens with career stuff. I'll coach somebody, they say they don't know what they want. 20 questions later, it turns out, well, I've always secretly wanted to be a marine biologist, but it's too late and I'm not smart enough and blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm. So what would be, if someone is trying to get closer to their desires or what they really want, what would be the first step? So we've talked about identifying, cognitive biases that we may have about ourselves, but in terms of desire specifically, what's the first thing that someone
I
can
like to ask a question like, if you knew that well, I mean, you have to, depends what area of their life it is, but like, if you knew you could, basically, it's questions that solve for their unconscious objections. If you knew you could succeed at anything, what would you do? If
Mhm.
you knew that I like to play that, if you knew everyone would approve of you and think it was amazing, what would you do? Right? If you knew that you could be happy no matter, I mean, the other reason that people sometimes get stuck, I think, in when they say they don't know what they want is that they're looking for a thing. They're looking for a decision that they think will make sure that they never have negative emotion or fear or regret in the future. So they're trying to make a decision now to prevent future emotion. Of course, that's impossible, so they can never land on a decision. And then their interpretation of that is, oh, I must not know what I want. It's like they've solved the equation wrong. That's not really the problem.
Mm.
So, but the answer is still sort of the same. It's like, if you knew you would feel good and everything would be fine, what would you choose? Just that simple question is pretty illuminating if you're willing to tell yourself the truth about it. And then you can see, oh, so why don't I do that? And that's where you get all your thoughts that are getting in the way.
Right. And when somebody identifies, so the woman says, yes, I would marry him in a second, or
Yeah.
yes, I would be a marine biologist if everybody approved of me and everyone loved me. So once they've identified what they do, what's the next step for them to pursue is there a template or a framework that you have in terms of how they can pursue that goal or that dream?
Well, they have to work on all those thoughts. So like, yeah, there's a whole bunch of different tools, but it really comes down to like, so let's say you're the woman who's in the relationship with the guy where you're telling yourself you don't know what you want, but truthfully you do. You want him to be all in and he's not. Okay,
Mhm.
now at least we have the reality of the situation, right? We're telling ourselves the truth. And I think sometimes we don't tell ourselves the truth because we think that means then we have to act on it, or then we'll have to be mean to ourselves if we don't. Or so I usually just start with like, okay, we don't have to take any action. Let's just tell ourselves the truth. I want, I'm all in. My partner, we don't want the same kind of relationship. Now what am I going to do? Let me just sit with that for a minute and like be with that truth. And then I think you have to start working through all of those thoughts to see. I don't think there's no, I don't believe that I know the right decision. Like, I don't know that the decision is that she should break up with him. I don't know that the decision is that she should change her thoughts to like the relationship. Like, there's a lot of different options, but I think it's so contextual, right? We have to go through and see like, okay, so if you know that you are all in and you and your partner don't want the same level of commitment, why are you staying in the relationship? Now, one person's answer might be, I don't believe I can find someone who wants to be all in with me. Okay, so then we got to deal with that thought, right? And then probably the answer is, working on increasing your confidence that you're good enough and there's enough out there that you end up being okay ending it. But someone else's thought might be, well, I like the relationship the way it is actually, but like if everybody approved of this, I would actually be fine with it. But I think my friends don't think that he's good enough for me. There's like something else going on. That's now we have a different probable resolution, which is actually, if you're actually okay with the way the relationship is, and you would want him to be more into commitments that other people would think X, or that you could think you were good enough, like then maybe the answer is working on your thoughts to actually be happy with what you have that you actually do want. So it's just not, it's so contextual, but the answer is always like, what are the thoughts that you can identify that are driving this behavior? And how can you start to shift them, whether it's using a neutral thought or a ladder thought or one of, the many other like coaching tools there are in the world. And I think the first step is always just like being honest with ourselves without judgment, which for women, again, especially, I almost always have to coach someone on whatever judgment shame they're creating for themselves about their thoughts before we can even get to the thoughts.
Yeah.
Right? There's like the minute they recognize a thought, then they just immediately judge themselves for having the thought. And like
Right.
we have to work through that original kind of first level always.
Let's talk about shame
Yeah,
and talk about guilt. I think again, I use the phrase baked into our DNA. I just, I don't mean that in a, we are born feeling shamed.
totally.
Of course we're not. This is something that we learn. How does one go about starting to release the idea? Well, first, do you distinguish between feeling guilty and feeling shameful? And if so, if there's a distinction in your mind, is there a way that we begin to release some of that shame so that we can move towards what we want? And I ask this because while you were talking about giving some of the different examples or different outcomes from your client, like she may be fine with it, she may be fine with it and she just wants acceptance from other people, or she may not be fine with it and she needs to sit with that for a minute. I think it would be really, it's very tricky uh, because you could very easily convince yourself of either I would be totally fine that he's not going to commit to me. I
See,
just,
I don't think that's people have that concern a lot. So it's a totally legitimate concern, but I don't really think it's true because I think that if you do the work and you're honest with yourself, the question is always why am I trying to push it towards a certain outcome? Right? And why? Like
right.
if I'm like working too hard to be okay with something, you want to check in with yourself about why. So I
Yes.
think that that's a common response I get about thought work is like, you could convince yourself to be in a relationship where someone beats you. Right. And I'm like, no, we would definitely be questioning, why do you want to be in this relationship so much? Right. Like, I don't think that any of us really stay in that kind of relationship because let me put it this way. I think without thought work, we are much more likely to trick ourselves into believing that we deserve what's happening, or we can't have anything better, or whatever somebody else tells us, right? That might like that we deserve what they're doing, or that we're the problem. We're much more likely to believe all of that. Like,
Mhm.
I think that thought work is really about having your own back. Like, when you develop your own self-compassion but also call yourself on your own shit, those two things have to go together, then you are so grounded in yourself that I think you are much less likely to, like, if you truly believe that you are okay no matter what and that you're good enough the way you are, why would you stay in a relationship you didn't want to stay in just to like feel accepted? You wouldn't have that motivation because you don't need that validation anymore. So I think it's only tricky when we are not being honest with ourselves, I think, in doing the work, which is part of the process for some of us, for sure, right? But you learn to feel it. It feels different in your body when you are when you have an agenda, when you're like, oh, I'm going to try to change my thoughts to feel okay with staying in this relationship without ever questioning, why do I want to stay in this relationship so much? Why is it so important? Why is it so scary to think I wouldn't be in this relationship? Like, that's what all of that work is for.
Yeah, I ask because I think as a society we don't have the tools and the frameworks to feel our feelings. I think that
Mm-hmm. Totally.
we completely dishonor, in this pursuit of happiness, this society that values, I don't want to say Stepford wife, but it's sort of like that,
Yeah, we think
where
we
it's
should be
like
happy all the time.
all the time. And I think it
Yeah.
dishonors our wholeness. I think
Mm-hmm.
anytime you feel sad or you feel, there's some discord, whether you feel there's some disassociative feeling between you and the reason why this relationship is causing you angst for whatever reason, the sadness, the grief, the, dare I say, depression and anxiety, I think are always an appropriate response. But we pathologize the human condition so much. We think that if we're feeling sad about the relationship, or I want to be a marine biologist, but I just like I'm X, Y, or Z. Like we run away from these feelings and we don't know
Mm-hmm.
how to sit or even just make some space in your
Totally.
body so we sit with them.
Yeah, I think people can use, I mean, the human mind can use thought work like it can use drinking or Netflix to escape your feel, right? Of course, like we can use anything to do that.
Mhm.
I think the way that I would say it is that um, I 100% agree that we have this unrealistic expectation that we should always be happy, and then we think if we're not, something's gone terribly wrong, right? Which is not the case. I've yet to meet the human who has a normally functioning brain and is always happy, right? This is negative emotion. It's a big part of human life. I think the way that I look at it is that, but I don't think that negative emotion necessarily means something true about the world or what's happening to you, right? So I can be in a relationship and one day I'll have totally happy thoughts about it and him and I feel great. And the next day I'll have a lot of negative thoughts about it and him and I'll feel terrible. And I don't believe that one of those is like more true than the other. So I do want to allow those negative emotions and have them and process them and look at them. But then I also think there's like, I have an episode where I talk about like clean versus dirty pain. And like, it's analogous, of course, what Buddhists would teach maybe about pain versus suffering. It's like some negative emotion, pain is essential, right? It's part of human life. Like if we didn't love people, we wouldn't mourn them. Like if we didn't, right? Those things have to go together. Without one, there's no meaning to the other. But then there's like unnecessary suffering we add on with our stories about how we're so terrible or other people don't love us or other people are wrong or people should be different or the world should be different, all that resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And we still have to have those emotions. They're also just part of being human. But
Mm-hmm.
those are the emotions, like when I think about like what's appropriate to use thought work to try to shift, I don't want to use thought work to like not be sad if my mother dies, right? Like that's a part of
Yeah.
mourning her. For me, some people might not feel that about their mother. I love my mother. I want to have that emotion. I'm not going to use thought work to try to not feel that. But I might use thought work on the pain that I'd be creating for myself with my story about my mother and how she didn't do what she should have done when she was alive and now she's dead. And so now I'll never get the apology I deserve from her, whatever, like that kind of pain is where I would use thought work. So I think, that negative emotion is always a part of human life and we have to feel it always. And then it's useful to look at what thoughts are causing this and do I want to keep it? And sometimes the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the answer is no.
Yeah, and I think our state also often determines the story. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you wake up in a funk for whatever reason, you didn't
Yeah.
sleep well or whatever, I think that the at least I'm speaking from personal experience. My state is going to determine the story that I tell myself about my
Mm-hmm.
relationship, about my role as a mother, about my role as a doctor, about whatever hat I wear. So I have often found, and I'm sure that you have a laundry list. So I'm sort of building up to this. Like for me, movement, when I
Mm-hmm.
move, I get out of my head. Like I just get out of the limbic system for a minute. I'm in my
Mm-hmm.
motor, I'm activating my motor cortex, prefrontal cortex, the area that is involved in regulating and dampening these sort of these ruminating thoughts. And I'm able to shift my state, shift my mood so that I can. So if it's the partner, if I say, God, like he didn't make me my coffee today, like, what
Right.
gives?
Divorce is coming. How dare he?
Divorce is coming. Like, God, like, what did I do? Like, I must be
Right.
the worst. If I just get out, if I just do some yoga, I go for a walk, I do
Mm-hmm.
some sprints, whatever.
Yeah.
Then I'm like, you know what? Maybe he needed to wake up early today to do X, Y, and Z and just forgot. Maybe it's just like him being a human being. Do you find that so like that you would use the term embodiment, which I really like. So I find getting into my body, like just getting underneath my throat, which is I like to live in my cortex.
Yeah. Don't we all? Right.
Yeah. Are there
Yeah.
other ways
I
that you
think
like?
Yeah, I think movement is good. Not everybody has like movement available to them in the same ways in their physical bodies. So I think it's good. It's not the only thing that people can do. I think breathing also, like I will, even I think that when you get particularly when your sort of fear or fight reflex is like really acted up, right? Sometimes it's a time when like some people have a very hard time even accessing their prefrontal cortex to do that kind of thinking, right? You have to like take down the intent, which is why processing your emotion is so important, to like take down that intensity so that you can even like get your prefrontal cortex like back online,
Mhm.
right? And so I often, and there are some cognitive techniques I find that work with that, which is sort of what you were saying with your son. They're less about changing thoughts and they're more just like reparenting. Like, I see you and that you're really scared right now, or that you're feeling very anxious. That's okay, right? It's just soothing, it's like self-soothing.
Mhm.
And then breathing also, especially for people who get physical manifestations of anxiety in the chest and their breath gets short. I think focusing on taking deep breaths often will, like, after 5-7 minutes of that, I find you've sort of, just like you were saying, you've like self-regulated alternative things that could have been going on, which is like, especially when you become aware of it, it's so interesting experience, right? You're like, this is the only possible explanation. Everything is terrible. And then
Right,
like you manage
right.
to like breathe or go for a walk, and then you calm down, and then your brain is like, oh, I'm sorry, I was out to lunch. Here's 15 other explanations for what could be going on.
Yes.
I was busy screaming, but
Yes.
actually here's like all these other ways I could think about this, which is why like one of the best practices you can have is like never send that text or email right away, right? It's
Yes.
like wait until that part of your brain has like reactivated. That's like, oh, there's more than one way to think about something in the world. So yeah, movement, breathing, some of that kind of self-talk that's not about shifting or changing, is just about like acknowledging and safety. Like, you're safe, you're okay. And I think especially like, I'm not sure when this will be released, but we're recording it in the middle of the kind of COVID pandemic, right? And people are, it's unfortunate that the symptoms of anxiety and shortness of breath are also some of the symptoms of
Right.
COVID, right? And so I'm doing a lot of coaching, and people are like, get themselves into these spirals, right? Where they're like a little anxious, they get a little short of breath and sensation in their chest, then they start to freak out that maybe they have COVID, right? And it becomes like that cycle. So I think that kind of self-talk of like, you're safe and soothing yourself or being is so crucial to help you distinguish between anxiety and whether you're having some sort of actual like illness manifestation, right?
Yeah, one of my girlfriends was on the podcast it was probably late January. We were talking about essential oils, but we got off on this whole tangent around, mental and emotional resilience. And the one thing she said, and this, I've been using this ever since. And it's so, whenever I'm feeling like, he forgets, like Giovanni, my partner, forgets to make me the coffee. And I'm like, that's it, we're getting divorced.
Right. Obviously.
Like obviously, right. The question that that she taught me, which is so simple, but it's hilarious. It's like, am I tired?
Oh yeah. Am I hungry? I'm always like, do you need a snack? You probably need a snack.
Like, are you tired? Is this,
Yeah.
maybe if you just took a little nap, like just power down for a second.
Totally. It's important to know what your thing is. Mine is like, I'm always like, I have a particular friend, Kelly, that we'll always text each other like, I almost quit my job, but then I had a sandwich and it turned out everything was okay.
Yeah.
It's just like, you have to like know I'm a big fan of the 10-minute cat nap sometimes to just
Yeah.
reset. It's just like breathing it just like resets my brain. Then I wake up and I'm like, oh yeah, okay. All right. Yeah, but hungry, cranky, tired, like any of those, I think can really make you. I saw a great meme. I can't remember how it goes, but it was basically like, if you hate everyone, you're probably hungry. If you probably need a nap. Like, just make sure your physical state is like in some equilibrium, and then you have the resources to do the mental work.
Just to touch on coronavirus and the pandemic now, I think that there's an opportunity. There's really two pandemics happening, right? There's one, which is the virus and the global economic whatever, which I cannot speak to.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also this mental and stress pandemic that's happening.
Totally.
And what I'm noticing, particularly from friends who lived through and had financial ruin in 2007, 2008, 2009, there's almost like this retriggering that's coming up. People are flipping out, and it can be unpredictable. Like, I've seen it's just for me observing online too, so there could be also just the bias of me not understanding tone because I'm seeing the way that people are just writing things. But be it economic trauma or just having been through a scenario like this before, is there a way for us to become awake to when we feel triggered? Because this is something I'm seeing a lot. And I'm, as you said, if you're coaching a lot on it now, are you seeing people becoming and being triggered is completely like there's something about this whole situation that, at least for a recovering perfectionist like myself, there's something unnerving about it. Like, there's something where I don't like my control being taken away from me. And I think that that's also a trauma response, right? Is there a way that we can begin to recognize when we are being triggered and how we are being triggered?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting. My experience with what's going on with people in this pandemic is that, in terms of the psychology, is that your brain doesn't, I don't think, change on a dime. So it's like whatever people were worried about before, they're still worried about. It's just like volume dial has been turned up and they're attaching it to the pandemic, right? So it's like I see people whose businesses have had to close down who are like, I'm going to figure this out. I always get through things, blah, 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 right? Whatever. But the people who were worried about money before the pandemic are now freaking out about money, even if they still have their jobs. So to me, that's been the most, and I think has been the most helpful for my clients, is like when you are feeling that kind of like anxious spiral feeling, right? Really looking at it takes a lot of the wind out of the sails, because I think your brain is like, listen, there's a pandemic, everything is different. Now every thought I have is 100% true. It's like your brain has been this
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
sketchy, like bad witness that's always lying, but it's like, now there's a pandemic. Every scary thought I have, we have to believe. Don't doubt me at all. Don't be skeptical. Like it's an emergency. I'm in charge, right? That's
Yeah.
not the useful part of your brain. So
Mhm.
even just being like, oh, interesting. Like I used to have regular health anxiety and now I'm worried about my health in the pandemic.
Mhm.
I noticed this in my own brain. The part of my life I've been working on the most intensely is my romantic relationship and partnership. And like, as soon as this happened, my brain was like, let's think obsessively about how this will impact our relationship. Right.
Mhm.
It's like, that's not the most obvious logical danger to worry about, but because that's the habit I had, that's where my brain went.
Mhm.
So I think like partly that first step is just being like, okay, I see that this feels very urgent and real. And I think the reason it's so challenging for people is not just like the circumstances change, but then normally when you're having a freak out about your life, everybody around you is doing their own thing. Right now, everybody's having a collective freak out. And there's usually like if I'm stressed about money, it's not like I go on Facebook and every single post is everybody else agreeing with me that there's not enough money in the world. Right.
Right.
But now
Right.
that's what's happening, is
Mhm.
that whatever your thoughts are, social media and the news are amplifying them, and we're all like glued to them even more. So I think like I think you're being triggered when you just start to feel that physical and mental agitation, right? When your
Mhm.
thoughts start racing, when your body starts feeling and I think I'm talking in a like obviously if you have clinical PTSD, then your triggers may manifest differently. I think we're talking about it in kind of a little bit more of a layperson way. But I think like just remembering that, no, like it's the same thing, bringing that awareness, like, what is my brain saying? Like,
Mhm.
is it really true? Like what's true right now? It's that same physical grounding also. Like most of us right now are physically safe. Most of us right now are physically well. Even if you're not physically well, like if you're thinking about this, you're not dead. Like where are you in your body? Like how can you ground back and stop that? Like it's like we're all engaged in a giant collective catastrophizing right now about the
Yes.
future.
Yes.
And like and I think the solution to catastrophizing is always twofold. It's like playing it out all the way mentally and grounding physically to where we really are right now. And like different people, I think, have to do those in different orders.
Mhm. No, that's great. Great advice. I love that. I often find too, when I myself feel anxious, I get all like verklempt in my,
Mm-hmm.
in my throat. Like I have a lot of pressure in my throat, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's for me, not speaking up when I, whatever manifestation that is, but I become aware if I'm being triggered by something. There's like this closing in that I feel where I have the words, but they don't, like, the vocal cords are not
Mm-hmm.
gonna come together to make the sound, you know?
So interesting. Yeah, everybody's bodies are so different in how mine is very like in the chest. It's like that anxiety, which is why I've been doing a lot even on myself of being like, okay, like let's learn to distinguish between what anxiety feels like and like what's actually medical. Like these are not the same thing. Yeah,
Yes.
mine is very chest, like tightening in the chest.
And it's subtle too, right? Like it can be,
Mm-hmm.
and it's so quick. This is why I love what you were saying about breath work. I have picked up meditation pretty steadily in the past year, and it just gives me that little bit of space between like when I
Mm-hmm.
want to react and when I want to scream and when I want to get triggered, to like
Yeah.
just allow for my PFC or my prefrontal cortex to be like, okay, just hold on, don't send the
Yeah.
text, don't
Right.
just calm, right? And the interesting thing about anxiety, when I hear or when I see what's being written, is people always, anxiety is almost like it's like a wind up around the future.
Totally.
So they
Yeah.
always are thinking about like, next week, if this doesn't change, I'm going to run out of money, or if this doesn't
Mm-hmm.
stop in a couple of weeks, then I'm going to have to do X, Y, or Z. So it's the breath work really brings you into the right now. So just to, echo back to you, you said, you're right now, I'm safe. There's no bear, there's no tiger in the
Right.
room. I know everyone's watching something with tigers on Netflix. I don't know, but there's no actual
Yeah, me neither,
tiger.
but I've seen that too, right?
I've
I'm
seen
not going to be
memes. I
eaten.
don't get it, but whatever. Maybe
Yeah.
we're talking about some tiger thing, but
Yeah, you're physically safe. And I think like I actually tend to with it's catastrophizing is a funny thing because it's like you were saying earlier, like if you just say to yourself, oh, that's crazy, it doesn't work, right? Because especially this part of your brain that evolved to just look for danger is like, no, I guess I should scream louder because you're not listening about how there's danger, right?
yeah, yeah.
But I really like to take it all the way. And I think that I'm not saying like, yay, a pandemic happened. Obviously, that's not my thought. But I do think that it's giving us this opportunity, right, to engage with what is always true, which is that we don't get to control our health and when we live or die, right? And so playing, and I don't say that to be flip, I think it's the most serious, like more philosophical work in the world, emotional work in the world is our own mortality. So, but like when somebody's brain is catastrophizing, I always think it's like the brain goes 80% of the way, but not all the way, right? It's like you might lose your job and then we just die in the street, right? It's like we really have to go. And so cognitively, I think it's useful to go all the way. Okay, what happens if I lose my job? Actually, what do I do? How would I deal with it? What happens if I get sick? How will I deal with it, right? What happens if I do have to go to the hospital? Like playing it all the way out, not in a way where you are thinking about your own agency. Like when we're catastrophizing, I think we're just watching it like it's this terrible movie that's going to happen to us and we're going to have nothing we're going to have no agency, we're not going to be able to do anything, we're not going to be able to think or feel, like it's just going to be it's like watching a scary movie. And so playing it out in a like what would I actually do? How would I want to think and feel then? How would I handle this? We're all more resilient than we think we are. We have to like tap into that ahead of time so that you have that trust with yourself of if the worst thing happened, I will deal with that when that happens. And I like trust myself to handle it.
That's great. There was a podcast episode I wanted to talk to you about, which I thought was so interesting. And you were talking about this idea of self-improvement shame. So I'm thinking about what we've talked about today. We're talking about, how we can neutralize our thoughts, how we can become awake to these cognitive biases that we've either inherited or that we have about ourselves, how we can get to understand and know what we really want, how to be able to understand our triggers. And let's say the person makes the decision and they say, okay, I want to become a marine biologist. Like that's the thing I really want. So that means I have to go back to university and take my qualifying science courses or whatever the steps that you've laid out in order to fulfill the dream or the goal that you have. And I've never heard of this before, but I've experienced it. So I really appreciated this episode that you did around self-improvement shame. So walk us through what that is and what happens. And then again, the tools, the frameworks, how we can sort of circumvent that and say, okay, like it's okay. So at least for me, I have had for the longest time a hard time it's hard for me to be a beginner because once I've mastered everything, it's like, it feels so good. And, you sort of marinate in that proficiency. So to suck, like to be willing to suck is hard for me.
Yeah.
And I work on it, I'm always a work in progress, but let's talk about self-improvement shame, what it is and how we can become aware of it and work through it.
Yeah. I mean, so the way that what I mean when I say self-improvement shame is really, it's sort of, there's twofold. The first level is when you are motivated to try to change out of shame, right? So you're like, well, I want to not yell at my kids as much because right now when I do, I tell myself I'm terrible. So if I just could learn to stop yelling at my kids, then I would feel good about myself, right? So you're trying to use, and I think a lot of us come to self-improvement or self-help or spiritual work out of that impulse. So it's not wrong as what leads you there, but that is how a lot of us get there, is like, I want to finally feel good about myself. So let me like work on myself and improve myself enough to finally feel good about myself. The problem is that if that's how you get there and you don't pay attention to that pattern, you just immediately start doing that and applying it to your own attempts at self-improvement, right? So you're like, let's say you sign up to work with me and you learn the coaching model I teach, and then you start judging and shaming yourself for not being perfect at using the coaching technique, right? You start judging and shaming yourself for still having negative thoughts, which of course you're a human, you're going to have them forever, but you've conveniently forgotten all the times I've said that part, right? And your brain is just only fixated on how you should be doing it perfectly. So I think it's a funny thing because that original shame does lead people to, I think, the opportunity for incredible spiritual and growth work. But it's like you came in on a coal chugging train. You have to like use the work to notice that's what brought you here, and then start to work on shifting that. So otherwise, like whether it's therapy or meditation or yoga or coaching, whatever it is, you just start to use it the same way you use anything else, which is to beat yourself up, tell yourself you're not good enough, try something, not be perfect at it, fail, and then give up forever, right? You'll just execute your same patterns, and it won't be that helpful because you're just
See, you suck,
manufacturing.
you shouldn't do it.
Yeah, you're just manufacturing more guilt and shame, And I see this, I have my feminist coaching community is called The Clutch, and we have a Facebook group. So I see like all the posts, right? And so many of the posts start out with like, I'm like, I should have this figured out by now, or like, I'm not, I don't have the model that we use completely correct, or like feeling bad or guilty about that or ashamed. And then of course it's so counterproductive because you're learning how to do something new. If you shame yourself, you're not receptive to feedback, right? You can't learn how to do it well because you feel so, it's like a lightning rod. You feel so ashamed if anybody points out where you have a blind spot.
Mm-hmm.
So it just makes it so much harder to actually learn about yourself because you're judging yourself all the time. So I think the antidote is the first and most important coaching tool in the whole world is just compassionate observation of yourself, right? And so noticing how often, I think most of us are just not even aware how often we're having self-judging thoughts because we just think they're true, right? We're just like, well, I am bad at this.
Yeah.
I should be better,
Mm-hmm.
right? A better mom wouldn't yell at her kids. Like, I haven't worked enough on the clutch materials. Like, we just think those are facts. So the first tool is just becoming aware, paying attention. Writing, this is why I always recommend like writing down your thoughts, but even if you're just thinking them, like just noticing how often you are. Sometimes I just say like, look for how often you're evaluating yourself, right? Like that's a good stand-in because most of our evaluations of ourselves are negative, right? Look how often you are like deciding whether you did something well or poorly, deciding whether it was good or bad, deciding if you did enough or not. Like just notice how often you are evaluating yourself. And then I think the second part is working on using thoughts that help you develop that self-compassion, which are, not everybody's ready for like, I love and accept myself completely right away, right? That's why we start with ladder thoughts like many mothers yell at their kids, even though they love them, right? Or I notice that I'm judging myself. Lots of people judge them because then they'll start judging themselves about the judging, right? It can be endless. So you just have to practice, number one, bringing your awareness to how often you're judging or evaluating yourself. And then number two, coming up with a thought that you can practice that helps you notice that that's happening. And I really teach that for me in my work, your thoughts are not moral. They don't have any moral value. They don't mean anything about you as a person. They're just electrical signals in your brain that are created by all of your conditioning. And so if you can start to believe that and practice seeing them that way, then you'll be able to observe them with more curiosity, right? If you're not ready for compassion, maybe you can try curiosity rather than judgment. If your thoughts don't mean anything about you as a person, then it's okay for you to have whatever thoughts you're having. And that's how we can start to become more aware of them, get to know them, and that's when we can start to change them.
I like that too. And even if that doesn't work, at the very least, you can tell yourself, your brain is the most associative organ that you have, right? So you can start to associate a new meaning with it. And I think that this comes at a really wonderful time because there's a lot of mothers right now that are homeschooling.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And I'm in that. I am a completely unqualified grade 4 and grade 2 teacher right now. And I say that in jest, but it's interesting because the stories that are coming up for me, like I know it's like, oh yeah, like you have to, why am I, and there's been moments where I've been much more frustrated with my kids than I normally am because I'm, all of their habits, because they're at home, they're not in the different environment at school where they
Right.
have associated with learning, and, there's rules in the school and all this kind of stuff. They're just like on the couch and they're flying off the couch and they're, so I'm
Right.
trying to figure out how to help them associate home now being
Mhm.
school. And I'm also doing work from home, and I'm trying to get, so there's this meme that I saw the other day, and I literally howled because it was a picture of Dolly Parton, her 9 to 5 is like not working 9 to 5. It's like 9 to 9:10, and then
Right.
9:16 to 9:32.
Right.
And that's how it feels.
Yeah, totally.
And it can be really egoic there's almost this like egoic
Mhm.
fantasy that you're just going to get it. Like, you just should be a good homeschooler. You just should
Totally.
be
I
able
call these
to.
perfectionist fantasies. I have a whole episode about perfectionist fantasies. And yeah, somebody just posted in the clutch the other day, like perfectionist fantasy homeschooling, reality homeschooling, right?
Yeah.
And then we judge ourselves for not living up to our perfectionist fantasies, even though they were always fantasies, right?
Always.
But we don't know that. We think that's how we're supposed to be. And then we judge ourselves. So learning how to recognize those. And if this resonates for people, I have a whole episode about it if you recognize yourself. But any kind of like, all of these fantasies of how it's like, my favorite thing about perfectionists is none of them think they're perfectionists because their thought is, well, I don't do things perfectly, so I'm
Mm.
not a perfectionist. Like the
Mhm.
amount, if I didn't nickel for every time I've heard that,
Mhm.
right? But of course, no, it's the whole point is that you think there is a perfect that you could or should be doing. That's what makes you a perfectionist, right?
Right.
And and I think that's coming up for people a lot now. Yeah, now people are supposed to be somehow doing their jobs and doing all the child care and doing all the cooking and cleaning because you can't go out. And I mean, right, it's impossible. You can't do 17 jobs at once. But we have this, yeah, it's amazing how quickly that can come up. But it's since experience didn't exist more than 3 weeks ago. But it's just your old brain pattern being like, oh, you should be perfect. Here's a whole new place to apply that to.
Right, right. Why don't you plug your podcast? And if people want to find more about you, about your programs, where can people find you?
Yeah, my podcast is called "Is It Okay to Curse on This?" I wasn't sure.
It
You
is
never know.
okay. Yeah, it's good. It's all good.
I've been restraining myself. Usually I curse like a sailor. My podcast is called Unfuck Your Brain, obvious reasons. And you can find it wherever you find podcasts. And I talk on the podcast about the Clutch, which is my feminist coaching community, how to work with me. But so you can find that all there. But I would check out, if anything I've said has made your brain go, huh, wait a minute, then I would check out the podcast. Is always the best place to learn more.
And on Instagram, social, are you
Oh
active?
yeah, it's just my last name is like such a pain to spell that but it's I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook. If you look at the title of this episode, maybe it'll have my name on it. It's a long one to spell, but there's only one of me in the world. So if you Google me, my Instagram is at Cara Lowenthiel. Same thing on Facebook. Just look for my name.
And I'll have all this information in our show notes as well for listeners that are interested.
There you go.
Well, I wanted to thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation. It's really fun when you sit down with someone and you just get along so well. I feel like I could talk to you for
Totally.
another couple hours. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, my
And yeah,
pleasure.
wanted to thank you for your time today. And I hope that people who are listening, that you will find this incredibly useful. And if there's one sort of takeaway here, is that you can change, right? Like, you are not, destitute to have this, unadaptable, static mind and thought pattern. There are ways that you can change, and we've discussed a lot of great ones today. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing, right? People think they can train their dog, but that they can't change their own brain. You can definitely change it at any age. Thank you for having me. It was great.
Thank you.